You'll have to think about assisted living sooner or later, Mom. We can't keep putting our lives on hold forever. My son said those words over dinner on a quiet Sunday evening, and something inside me went completely still. Not broken. Not angry. Just still. I smiled, nodded, and took another sip of my iced tea as if I hadn't just heard the truth hidden behind years of polite smiles and delayed phone calls. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 72 years old, a widow, a mother of 2, and according to my children, a burden. At least, that's what I finally realized that evening. The restaurant was one of those family places with red leather booths and framed black and white photos of old Main Street hanging on the walls. The kind of place where families gathered after church and grandparents spoiled their grandchildren with extra dessert. Daniel sat across from me with his wife Amanda beside him. My daughter Rebecca sat at the end of the table scrolling through her phone between conversations. We were supposed to be celebrating my birthday. 72. Not exactly a milestone people throw parades for, but I thought it mattered enough for one dinner together. I'd spent the afternoon looking forward to it. I'd even worn the pearl earrings my late husband, Thomas, gave me on our 40th wedding anniversary. The conversation drifted from work schedules to vacation plans. Rebecca talked about a cruise she wanted to take next spring. Amanda complained about property taxes. Daniel spent most of the evening checking emails. Then somehow the subject turned to aging. It always does when you reach a certain age. People stop asking what your plans are and start discussing what should happen to you. You know, Amanda said casually while cutting into her chicken, there are some really nice senior communities around here. Rebecca nodded. My friend's mom moved into one last year. She loves it. I laughed softly. I'm doing just fine in my house. For now, Daniel replied. But things change. The way he said it bothered me. Not because it was cruel. Because it sounded rehearsed. Like a conversation they'd already had without me. I looked around the table. Nobody met. My eyes. That's when Daniel delivered the sentence I'll never forget. You'll have to think about assisted living sooner or later, Mom. We can't keep putting our lives on hold forever. Putting our lives on hold. I wanted to ask what exactly they had sacrificed for me. The phone calls that lasted less than 3 minutes. The holiday visits they left early? The birthdays they forgot until the next day? But I didn't ask. I simply smiled. Because in that moment, I understood something important. The problem wasn't that my children thought I needed help. The problem was that they had started seeing me as an obligation instead of a mother. Later that night, I drove home alone. The porch light illuminated the small white house Thomas and I had bought 46 years ago. Every board, every window, every flower bed carried a memory. I sat in my car for several minutes staring at the front door. The silence felt different somehow. Clearer. Like a fog had finally lifted. The next morning, I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and opened a folder I hadn't touched in years. Inside were investment statements, property records, and documents most people would never have guessed existed. My children certainly didn't know. As I turned the pages, a strange sense of peace settled over me. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about what I owed my family. I was thinking about what my family had shown me. And before the week was over, I would make a decision that would change every one of their lives forever. For the next few days, I found myself looking at old memories differently. Not with sadness, but with clarity. Every room in my house seemed to tell 2 stories at once. The first was the story I had always believed. The story of a hard-working mother who had devoted her life to her family. The second was the story I was only beginning to see. The story of how gradually, almost invisibly, I had become less of a person and more of a resource. On Tuesday morning, I opened a photo album that had been sitting on my bookshelf for years. There was Daniel at age 10, standing beside the bicycle I had saved 6 months to buy. There was Rebecca at her college graduation, wearing the cap and gown that I had helped pay for after taking extra shifts at the accounting office. I smiled at the photographs. I did not regret a single sacrifice. What hurt was realizing how easily those sacrifices had been forgotten. Around noon, my phone rang. For a brief moment, I thought it might be one of the children checking on me after our dinner conversation. Instead, it was a telemarketer trying to sell home warranty coverage. I laughed softly after hanging up. The irony was almost funny. A stranger had spent more time talking to me that week than my own family. On Wednesday, I drove to the grocery store. While loading bags into my trunk, I spotted an old friend from church, Eleanor Whitaker. She was 76 and had lost her husband several years before I lost Thomas. We stood in the parking lot talking for nearly 40 minutes. She asked how I was doing. Not as a formality. She actually listened to the answer. Before leaving, she squeezed my hand and said, "Margaret, do not spend your remaining years chasing people who only show up when it is convenient." Her words stayed with me the entire drive home. That evening, I made a simple dinner and sat alone at my kitchen table. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt honest. My children had busy lives. I understood that. But busy people still find time for what matters. That was the thought I could not escape. On Thursday afternoon, Rebecca finally called. I noticed immediately that her voice carried an unusual enthusiasm. She spent several minutes talking about rising housing prices and how much larger my property seemed compared to most homes in the neighborhood. Then she casually asked whether I had ever considered downsizing. I answered politely and changed the subject. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not ask whether I needed anything. When the call ended, I stared at the phone for several seconds before setting it down. That night, I pulled out a legal folder and reviewed documents I had not examined in years. Investment accounts. Property records. Insurance policies. Everything Thomas and I had built over decades of careful planning. As I organized the papers into neat stacks, I noticed something unexpected. I did not feel angry. I felt calm. The kind of calm that comes when a difficult truth finally stops hiding. My children believed they knew exactly what their future looked like. What they did not know was that I had begun asking myself a question that would change everything. If the people who inherited my legacy no longer valued me while I was alive, why should they automatically receive everything after I was gone? The following Monday, I decided to stop guessing and start paying attention. For years, I had explained away things that should have concerned me. Delayed visits. Forgotten promises. Conversations that always seemed to drift toward money, property, or future plans. I told myself that families changed as children grew older. I told myself that life was busy. But once I stopped making excuses for everyone else, certain patterns became impossible to ignore. That afternoon, Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice sounded cheerful, almost unusually so. He asked how I was feeling, whether I needed help with anything around the house, and whether I had thought more about downsizing. The question appeared so naturally that someone else might have missed it. I did not. He circled back to the subject 3 different times during a conversation that lasted less than 15 minutes. After we hung up, I sat quietly in my living room staring at the family photographs above the fireplace. It was strange. The more interest my children showed in my future plans, the less interest they seemed to show in my actual life. Later that week, Rebecca invited me to lunch. She chose an upscale restaurant overlooking the river downtown. At first, I felt hopeful. Maybe I had been too harsh. Maybe she genuinely wanted to spend time together. For the first 20 minutes, we talked about ordinary things. The weather. Her work. A neighbor who had recently moved away. Then she leaned forward and asked whether I had updated my estate documents recently. The question landed between us like a stone. I smiled politely and took a sip of water before answering. She quickly explained that she was only concerned about making things easier for everyone someday. Easier for everyone. I noticed she never once asked what I wanted. She never asked what would make my life easier. On the drive home, memories began resurfacing one after another. Daniel asking about property values during holiday dinners. Amanda making comments about how large my house was for one person. Rebecca mentioning retirement communities whenever we spoke. None of those moments had seemed important on their own. Together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. By Friday evening, I found myself standing in the hallway outside my home office. Inside the closet sat several boxes filled with financial records dating back decades. Thomas had always been meticulous. Every investment, every account, every deed, everything organized and labeled. I spent hours reviewing documents under the soft glow of a desk lamp. The numbers surprised even me. Years of careful planning had produced far more than most people realized. Enough to change lives. Enough to create opportunities for generations. As midnight approached, I closed the final folder and sat back in my chair. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. The house felt peaceful. For the first time in months, my thoughts felt peaceful too. Because a difficult realization had finally become impossible to avoid. My children were already making plans for a future that depended on what I would leave behind. What they did not realize was that I had quietly begun considering a future where none of those plans included them at all. The following week brought an unexpected sense of purpose. For months, maybe even years, I had been reacting to life instead of directing it. Now, for the first time since Thomas passed away, I felt as though I was making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what everyone else expected. On Tuesday morning, I scheduled an appointment with our longtime attorney, Richard Bennett. He had handled several legal matters for Thomas and me over the years. He was in his late 60s, calm, thoughtful, and not easily surprised. When I arrived at his office, he greeted me warmly and offered me coffee. After a few minutes of small talk, he leaned back in his chair and asked what had brought me in. I looked at him for a moment before answering. I would like to review my estate plan. He nodded immediately and began gathering documents. There was no judgment in his expression. No assumptions. Just professionalism. For nearly 2 hours, we went through every detail. Property. Investments. Savings accounts. Insurance policies. Charitable interests. As the meeting continued, Richard asked a simple question. Has something changed? I thought carefully before answering. No, I said. I think I have finally noticed what has been changing for years. He did not press further. Good attorneys know when silence says more than words. When the meeting ended, he handed me a folder and suggested I take a few weeks before making any final decisions. On the drive home, I stopped at a small coffee shop near the park. The autumn air carried a slight chill, and golden leaves drifted across the sidewalk. I sat near the window with a cup of coffee and watched people pass by. Young parents pushing strollers. Couples walking hand in hand. Retirees enjoying the afternoon sunshine. Everyone seemed busy living their lives. And suddenly I realized something important. I had spent so much time worrying about whether my children valued me that I had stopped asking whether I valued myself. That realization stayed with me. Over the next several days, I began doing things I had postponed for years. I joined a local gardening club. I attended a community fundraiser. I even signed up for a watercolor class at the senior center. The funny thing was that nobody there cared about my assets, my house, or my estate. They cared whether I enjoyed myself. They cared whether I showed up. One Friday afternoon, while returning from the garden center with several new rose bushes in the back of my car, my phone rang. It was Daniel. His tone sounded unusually enthusiastic. He asked whether I would be home that weekend because he and Amanda wanted to stop by. Before ending the call, he casually mentioned that he had been researching property values in my neighborhood. I thanked him for his concern and hung up. Then I sat quietly in my driveway for several moments. A few months earlier, that conversation would have hurt me. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. The more independent and fulfilled my life became, the clearer everyone else's intentions seemed. And somewhere deep inside, a decision that had once felt impossible was slowly becoming inevitable. That weekend arrived with unusually clear skies and cool autumn temperatures. I spent Saturday morning planting the rose bushes I had purchased earlier in the week. The soil was soft from recent rain, and for several hours I lost myself in simple work. There was something satisfying about placing roots into the ground and trusting they would bloom in their own time. Around noon, Daniel and Amanda pulled into the driveway. I saw them through the front window before they reached the porch. Both carried bright smiles that seemed slightly too polished. I welcomed them inside and offered coffee. Amanda complimented the house almost immediately. She commented on the hardwood floors, the updated kitchen, and the large backyard. Daniel wandered through several rooms as though he were seeing them for the first time. At one point, he stood near the living room window and remarked that homes in the neighborhood were selling for impressive prices. I listened quietly while pouring coffee into 3 mugs. The conversation remained pleasant on the surface. We talked about work, the weather, and upcoming holiday plans. Yet beneath every topic, I sensed something else moving quietly through the room. Eventually Daniel leaned forward and folded his hands on the table. "Mom, have you given any more thought to simplifying things?" he asked. "What things?" I replied. "The house. The maintenance. The future." Amanda nodded sympathetically. "We just worry about you being here alone." I smiled. It was an interesting phrase. They worried about me being alone, yet neither of them had visited in nearly 3 months before that afternoon. "I appreciate the concern," I said. "But I enjoy living here." Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Amanda. It lasted only a second, but it told me more than either of them realized. The subject changed soon afterward, yet a strange feeling lingered. Long after they left. That evening, while cleaning dishes, I noticed I had missed a call from an unfamiliar number. A voicemail had been left. Curious, I pressed play. The message came from a woman named Emily Parker. The name immediately sounded familiar. Then I remembered. Emily had been one of the caregivers who occasionally assisted Thomas during the final months of his illness. Her voice was warm and respectful. She explained that she had recently come across an old thank you note Thomas had written and wanted to reach out to see how I was doing. Nothing more. No request. No favor. Just kindness. The next afternoon, I returned her call. What began as a brief conversation lasted nearly an hour. We spoke about Thomas, about gardening, about books, and about life after loss. Not once did she ask about money, property, or future plans. When we ended the call, I realized something remarkable. I felt lighter. Over the following weeks, Emily and I stayed in touch. Sometimes through phone calls. Sometimes over coffee at a small cafe near the park. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered details. She asked questions because she genuinely cared about the answers. One afternoon, as we sat watching ducks glide across the pond, she said something that stayed with me. People should never have to earn basic kindness from their own family. I looked out across the water and felt a quiet ache in my chest. Because deep down, I knew she was right. And as the leaves continued falling from the trees around us, I began to understand that the people who shared your last name were not always the people who truly showed up when your heart needed them most. As November settled in, the distance between what people said and what they actually meant became easier for me to recognize. The trees outside my kitchen window had lost most of their leaves, exposing branches that had been hidden all summer. In many ways, my family relationships felt the same. The decorations were gone. The truth was easier to see. One Thursday evening, Rebecca called and suggested we have dinner together the following week. Her invitation sounded warm enough, but there was something unusual about her timing. For months, our conversations had been brief and infrequent. Suddenly she wanted to spend an entire evening together. I accepted politely. When we met at a restaurant downtown, the first half hour felt pleasant. We talked about work, mutual friends, and holiday plans. Then the conversation shifted. It always seemed to shift. Rebecca mentioned rising healthcare costs. She talked about the importance of planning ahead. Eventually she asked whether I had considered giving someone power of attorney in case I ever needed assistance. I watched her carefully while she spoke. She sounded concerned. She probably even believed she was being helpful. But beneath the concern was an assumption that I had begun noticing everywhere. My future was something they discussed, not something they shared with me. After dinner, I drove home feeling strangely calm. A year earlier, the conversation would have left me hurt. Now it simply became another piece of a puzzle that was nearly complete. The next afternoon, Emily stopped by with a small pumpkin pie from a local bakery. We sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee while sunlight filtered through the windows. She told me stories about her patients. Not their illnesses. Their lives. The places they had traveled. The lessons they had learned. The regrets they carried. At one point she smiled and asked, "What is something you still want to do?" The question caught me off guard. It had been a long time since anyone asked about my dreams instead of my arrangements. We spent nearly an hour discussing places I wanted to visit and projects I wanted to start. When she left, I realized something important. My children often spoke about managing my future. Emily spoke about helping me enjoy it. A few days later, I received an email from Daniel. Attached was a brochure for a luxury retirement community nearly 50 miles away. He had highlighted several sections and added a note explaining how much easier life might become if I moved there. Easier for whom? I wondered. I closed the email and stared out the window. Across the yard, the rose bushes I had planted weeks earlier were still standing strong despite the colder weather. There. Roots were taking hold beneath the surface where nobody could see them. I smiled at the thought. Because while my children believed they were gradually guiding me toward decisions that benefited everyone, they had no idea I was quietly preparing a decision of my own. And unlike theirs, mine would not be based on convenience. It would be based on character. December arrived quietly. The first frost appeared across the lawn one morning, covering the grass in a thin layer of silver that sparkled beneath the sunrise. I stood at the kitchen window holding a cup of coffee and watched the neighborhood wake up. For the first time in a very long time, I felt certain about the direction my life was taking. The uncertainty that had followed me after Thomas passed away was slowly disappearing. In its place was clarity. A few days before Christmas, I met with Richard Bennett again. This time I carried a folder filled with notes I had been keeping for weeks. Observations. Reflections. Questions I had asked myself honestly. He listened carefully while I explained my thoughts. When I finished, he folded his hands and looked at me thoughtfully. "Are you comfortable with this decision?" he asked. I smiled. "More comfortable than I have been with anything in years." He nodded and began preparing the paperwork. There was no drama. No anger. No desire for revenge. Only a woman deciding where her life's work should go. When I left his office that afternoon, the sky was clear and bright. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in a long time. That weekend, Daniel invited me to a family gathering at his house. Rebecca would be there as well. The evening started pleasantly enough. Christmas decorations filled every room. Holiday music played softly in the background. Yet as the night progressed, certain conversations caught my attention. At one point, Amanda mentioned how expensive homes had become. Later, Rebecca joked about which family member would eventually inherit the antique grandfather clock that stood in my living room. Everyone laughed. I smiled too. But inside, something felt different. They were speaking about my belongings as though they already belonged to someone else. The most revealing moment came near the end of the evening. Daniel sat beside me on the couch and casually asked whether I had made any progress deciding what to do with the house. I told him I was considering several options. His expression brightened immediately. Not because he was happy for me. Because he assumed those options would somehow benefit him. On the drive home, I thought about the contrast between the people in my life. My children seemed interested in what I owned. Emily seemed interested in who I was. The difference could not have been clearer. A few days later, Emily stopped by with homemade cookies and a small Christmas ornament shaped like a rose. We spent the afternoon talking and laughing about old stories. Before leaving, she handed me a handwritten card. Inside, she thanked me for my friendship and said that getting to know me had been one of the highlights of her year. I sat quietly after she left, reading those words again. They were simple, genuine, and worth more than she probably realized. That night, I placed the card inside my desk drawer beside the documents Richard had prepared. Then I looked around the room that Thomas and I had built together over decades. Everything was finally falling into place. The decision had been made. The papers were nearly complete. And although nobody else knew it yet, the future my children had been quietly counting on was about to disappear forever. January arrived with cold mornings and clear skies. The holiday decorations had been packed away, and the house felt peaceful again. One Tuesday afternoon, I returned to Richard Bennett's office to sign the final documents. The process took less than an hour. A few signatures. A few witnesses. A few carefully reviewed pages. Yet the significance of those papers represented decades of work, sacrifice, and intention. When everything was complete, Richard placed the folder in front of me and asked if I wished to keep a copy at home. I nodded. As I slipped the documents into my bag, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness. Only certainty. On the drive back, I stopped at the cemetery where Thomas was buried. The winter wind moved gently through the trees as I stood beside his headstone. For several minutes, I simply stood there in silence. Then I smiled. Not because I was happy about how things had unfolded, but because I finally felt at peace with my decision. Thomas had always believed that character mattered more than entitlement. He believed kindness revealed who people truly were when nobody was watching. Looking back, I knew he would understand exactly why I had chosen this path. The weeks that followed brought a noticeable change in my children's behavior. Daniel called more frequently than usual. Rebecca suddenly seemed eager to schedule lunches and family outings. Amanda even dropped off a basket of baked goods one afternoon with a handwritten note thanking me for everything I had done for the family over the years. To an outside observer, these gestures might have appeared heartwarming. But timing has a way of revealing motives. For years, genuine interest had been scarce. Now, as conversations increasingly drifted toward future plans, finances, and long-term arrangements, the pattern became impossible to ignore. One evening, Daniel invited me to dinner at his house. During dessert, he casually mentioned that he had spoken with a financial advisor about estate planning. Rebecca immediately joined the conversation. Before long, both of them were discussing inheritance taxes, property transfers, and asset protection strategies as though they were talking about the weather. I listened quietly while stirring my coffee. Neither seemed to notice that the entire discussion centered on what would happen after I was gone rather than how I was living now. On the drive home, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because these were still my children. Relief because any lingering doubt had finally disappeared. A few days later, Emily and I met for coffee at our usual cafe near the park. Snow flurries drifted past the windows while people hurried along the sidewalks outside. We talked for nearly 2 hours about books, travel, and the goals we still hope to pursue. At one point, she laughed at something I said, and I realized how rare simple joy had become in my life before our friendship began. As we prepared to leave, she thanked me for always making time for her. I smiled quietly. If only she knew how much that simple friendship had already changed the course of my future. Because by then, every decision had been finalized. Every document had been signed. And the people who believed they understood exactly what awaited them were only weeks away from discovering that everything they expected had already slipped beyond their reach. The truth finally revealed itself on a bright morning in early spring. Richard Bennett had arranged a meeting at his office and invited everyone who needed to be there. Daniel arrived first, followed by Amanda and Rebecca. They greeted me warmly, but I could sense their curiosity. Nobody seemed entirely sure why the meeting had been called. Emily arrived a few minutes later looking slightly confused. She had only come because I asked her to. When everyone was seated, Richard opened a folder and began speaking. The room grew quiet. He explained that my estate plan had been finalized and that I wanted certain details shared while I was still alive. I watched the faces around the table carefully. At first there was polite interest. Then came surprise. Then disbelief. Richard outlined the charitable fund that would support educational scholarships in our community. He described several gifts designated for organizations that had mattered to Thomas and me throughout our lives. Finally, he explained that a significant portion of my estate would be entrusted to Emily Parker, the person who had shown me consistent kindness, friendship, and respect when she expected absolutely nothing in return. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Rebecca blinked several times as though she had misheard. Daniel shifted in his chair. Amanda stared down at the table. Emily looked completely stunned. "Margaret," she said softly, "I never wanted anything from you." I smiled. I know. Those 3 words carried more meaning than any speech I could have given. Richard then handed Daniel and Rebecca each a sealed letter. I had spent weeks writing them. Neither opened the envelope immediately. The atmosphere in the room had changed. The assumptions they carried for years had vanished in a matter of minutes. Eventually, Daniel unfolded his letter. Rebecca did the same. I watched their eyes move across the page. There were no accusations. No anger. No list of grievances. I simply told them the truth. I wrote that I had loved them every day of their lives and always would. I reminded them of the sacrifices Thomas and I made willingly because that is what parents do. Then I explained something they had never understood. A legacy is not a reward for being related to someone. It is a reflection of trust, gratitude, and character. I told them that over time, they had become more interested in my possessions than my happiness. More concerned about my plans than my well-being. I explained that kindness is measured by what people do when there is nothing to gain. When Richard finished speaking, nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. The room remained quiet. Emily wiped away tears. Daniel stared at the letter in his hands. Rebecca looked down at the table. For the first time in years, nobody was talking about property values, inheritance, or future transfers. They were forced to confront something far more valuable. The consequences of their own choices. As we left the office that day, sunlight filled the parking lot. I took a deep breath and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. My future no longer belonged to expectations, obligations, or assumptions. It belonged to me. And for the first time since Thomas passed away, I knew with complete certainty that I had honored both his memory and my own.